Well, good morning, church family. We are reading from God's Word today in Ruth, chapter 2, verses 14 through 23. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "That man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
So when I was in fifth grade, I went to church camp, and over the course of a week of church camp in fifth grade, I had two girlfriends. And then after that, I went on about a 20-year dry spell until I met who is now my wife, Laura. So I had a solid decade. I met her in my early 30s. We got married when I was 33. So I had a solid decade of adult life where I was single. And for me, and I think this is the way it is for many who are single adults, that you start thinking, right? You start thinking about, well, what am I looking for in a relationship? What are some of the qualities that I'm looking for in someone that I would like to be with? And maybe you even make a list. Right? You make a list of certain qualities that you want. Maybe you're like, I want them to be a Christian, right? You start with that, someone who loves the Lord. And then I want them to be cute. I want them to be, funny or whatever. You might have a list of things. My wife, she actually wrote a list, and on it, she said that she wanted the man to be a cowboy, which God has a sense of humor. Because I went to the University of Wyoming, and so there is a little logo of a cowboy on a horse on my diploma. That's as far as it goes for me with being a cowboy. But nonetheless, she did marry a cowboy. So you come up with a list of things that maybe you are looking for. Now, what I think is interesting is that the passage that we're looking at today kind of cuts through the fog. And I would say really gets at the heart of what it is that anybody who's looking to be in a relationship should be thinking about. Or if you're already in a relationship, be thinking about, well, this is the kind of person, right, that I want to be, right? So we're going to see that in this passage. There's one quality that really stands out in terms of what you might be looking for in a relationship. Okay, today we are continuing in our series on the book of Ruth, and we've been working our way through the book of Ruth, and just going through it section by section. And we saw in the first chapter, right, it starts off on a well, not a very happy note. We read about Naomi and her husband Elimelech and their two sons who are living in Bethlehem, and they are forced to go to Moab because of a famine. So they go to Moab, and they're there. The two sons meet and marry two Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then tragedy strikes. Naomi's husband Elimelech dies, and then both of her sons die as well. And so then she comes back to Bethlehem. Ruth, one of her daughters-in-law, comes back with her, but they're in a very difficult situation economically, financially. They don't have really anything to support them. And so Ruth is kind of placed in a position of needing to kind of beg. And so she finds herself walking through the fields in the region of Bethlehem, the barley fields, hoping that somebody will look favorably upon her. And of course, we come across Boaz, who does precisely this. So the passage we're reading now, we're just right smack dab in the middle of the meeting of Boaz and Ruth. And Boaz is kind of a unique individual in the Bible. And here's what I mean by this. So when you read the Bible and you read different Old Testament figures, right? I think one of the things we tend to do, our basic posture, is we look at some of these great heroes of the faith, Abraham, David, and we think to ourselves, man, I want to be more like Abraham, or I want to be more like David, or maybe you're even thinking, ladies, you're like, I want to marry a guy who has the faith of Abraham, or a guy who loves the Lord like David. And I'd say that's great, but you know what? You need to read the stories a little more carefully, because you discover that Abraham, for example, you know what? Yes, he exercises faith, but there are also times when he shows a remarkable lack of faith, right? So in one instance, he and his wife Sarah are forced to go to Egypt for a famine, right? Common theme here. Forced to go to Egypt for a famine, and Abraham is terrified to go because he's worried. He's worried that somebody, some powerful person in Egypt, is going to kill him and take his wife Sarah, right? Because Sarah is so beautiful. So he's like, yeah, they see her, they're going to kill me and take her as their wife. And so what does Abraham do? Does he go to Egypt and does he man up? No, he does not man up. He decidedly does not man up. What does he do? He tells everybody that she is his sister. And he's like, yeah, you can go ahead and have her, kind of thing, right? And you tell me, ladies, is that the kind of man you're looking for? What about David? What about David, right? David, oh man, a man after God's own heart, pursues the Lord. Except for he does the very thing that Abraham was afraid would happen to him. Right? David sees a woman that he finds beautiful. She happens to be married. He's like, no problem. I'll just whack him and take her as my wife. So, again, is that what you're looking for in a man? Now, we often do this. We'll look at some of these Old Testament figures and idolize them, and they exemplify what we want to be, the faith of Abraham, the heart of David. But the reality is when you look at these figures, they all have issues. They all have, and what actually the Apostle Paul ends up kind of summarizing what we find in all of these Old Testament figures, and then indeed in all of us, and that is this. Paul says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There is not one who is righteous, not one. However, Boaz, he kind of makes you wonder if maybe there is. That's what's kind of interesting about Boaz. He kind of comes out of this whole story relatively unscathed. He's one of the very few characters in the Bible where it's kind of hard to find something wrong with him. And when we look at Boaz, I would suggest that there is one particular characteristic that really stands out about Boaz. And we find it here in verse 20. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he, this is Boaz, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Now, how many of you, I guess all the kids went downstairs, so that's, well, not all of them. Okay, some of you, okay. We got Louise over there, okay. Okay, some of you guys are here. Okay, school's about to start up, right, kids? You guys excited for school? Guys, you excited for English class? Ready to study some grammar? Yeah? Relative pronouns, are you pumped? Yeah, well, what's interesting here, you get a little lesson early on to kind of get you ready for school. There is an interesting grammatical ambiguity in this passage, which as we've seen as we've gone through Ruth, there are often times where what is worded is somewhat ambiguous. And it seems like the author is intentionally making some things ambiguous so it can be read in a number of different ways. And we find the same thing here in this verse, right? Verse 20, and Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Here we have this relative pronoun whose, and what's interesting is we aren't totally sure what is the antecedent. In other words, it could refer to the kindness of God, or it could refer to the kindness of Boaz. And it's somewhat ambiguous, and I would suggest that that is intentional. But certainly at one level, and we'll start with this, it does refer to the kindness of Boaz. And so we find this one quality which really stands out about Boaz, and that Boaz is an incredibly kind person. So here's what I would suggest. Any of you who maybe are single, looking to be in a relationship, look, I hope you find somebody who's cute, hope you find somebody who's funny. Maybe you'll even find a cowboy. But I would encourage, above just about anything else, look for someone who is kind. Kindness. We see this in Boaz. We saw it last week in Ruth. She is a very kind person. I would suggest that kindness, actually, might be the fundamental characteristic of a growing Christian. That as a Christian is growing, right? Nobody's perfect, but as we are growing, we will increasingly become more and more kind. Now, some of you are like, wait a minute, Kevin, what do you mean kindness is the chief quality of a Christian? I thought it was love, right? Isn't love? Paul talks about faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love, right? And Jesus, when he's asked, what are the great commandments? He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? Isn't it love? Isn't that the central thing we should seek to embody? Well, here's what we need to do. We need to get a better understanding of what kindness is. Here's a definition that Alexander Strauch gives of kindness. Look what he says here. Kindness is a readiness to do good, to help, to relieve burdens, to be useful, to serve, to be tender, and to be sympathetic to others. It has been said, kindness is love in work clothes. You see, kindness is love in action. Right? Just love. Love is such a sappy word. Love is the thing of music and poetry. Kindness. It's love in work clothes. It's love in action. It's love that seeks to serve. It's love that seeks to be useful. It's love that seeks to be tender, sympathetic to others. My question for all of us as Christians is, are we known for our kindness? Are we known for our willingness to serve? Are we known for our tenderness? Our willingness to be sympathetic to others? Right? Is that something that we are known for? It stands out as a quality that is central to who we are. Does our society see us that way as kind people? Are we kind, I don't know, on social media? Are the things that we post kind? Are they tender? Are they sympathetic? The reality is we live in an age where I think we need to see more kindness. In a divided world, kindness could go a long ways. Okay, so kindness is this primary quality that we see in Boaz. But I'd like to highlight is in this passage then 3 further dimensions of kindness. We're going to start there, okay? The truly kind person is a person who extends kindness to all people. Right? They don't just show kindness to some people, like the people they like, the people they find agreeable, right? They're kindness to all people. And we sort of see this in Boaz because we notice that Boaz is kind to a number of different people. First, we see that he's kind to his employees. Look at this in verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, Lord, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. Right? He comes out, he says, the Lord be with you to his employees. We see this kindness towards them. And then we see his kindness towards Ruth in verse 14. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. She sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. Now, I don't know if this stands out to us in our modern context as it would have stood out in that day, but the idea of inviting somebody to eat with you was a big deal certainly in ancient Israelite society. That there was you'd only invite people to eat with you they were one of you. They were family. So inviting somebody to come and share a meal with you was a way of saying, you're welcome here. You're part of our family. It was this incredible act of kindness. And we see him extending this to a Moabite woman, as we've seen. She was a non-Israelite. In fact, we saw that at this particular time historically, the Moabites were oftentimes the enemies of the Israelites. And yet we see Boaz being kind even to this Moabite woman. So we see this idea that the truly kind person doesn't compartmentalize their kindness. They're not just kind to the people who are kind to them. They're not just kind to the people whom they find agreeable. And I'm not suggesting that everybody's got to be your best friend. That's not what we're saying here, right? I mean, you have your best friends. You have the people with whom you perhaps share more intimately, that you're closer with. That's fine. And everybody has to be your best friend. But you can be kind to everyone, right? Again, I think especially in our society today, kindness could go a long way. In our culturally divided world, we live in a world where I think a lot of us, I think especially as Christians, we feel like, you know what? No, man, I've got to say the truth. I've got to speak the truth in the context of so much falsehood. And you know what? You're absolutely right. We need to speak the truth. But here's an important principle we need to understand. Truth always functions in the service of love or kindness. Truth always functions in the service of love, right? Because you got to realize this, the primary truth of God, you know what the fundamental truth of God is? God is love. That is the fundamental truth. And so any other truth is used to support and promote the love of God. So truth always functions in the service of love. It's like love is the master and truth is the servant. And so truth, no matter what the truth is, always must function in the service of love. In other words, when we say the truth, we always need to be saying, is this promoting God's love? Am I saying it in a way? Am I approaching this in a way that communicates love? Now, the other person may not feel that, right? That's not on you. But am I attempting to simply rebuke falsehood? Or am I attempting to promote the love of God in the way in which I am communicating? So here we see kindness, even in the way we speak the truth, must be central to our public discourse as well. We need to be kind to everybody. Democrats, kind to Republicans. Republicans, kind to Democrats. Young to old, old to young, right? Whatever it may be, kindness is this primary quality of a Christian, and the truly kind person extends kindness to all people. That's the first principle that emerges here. Second one is this. The truly kind person does more than what is expected. What we find here in this passage is that Boaz goes beyond what is expected. Now there is something that is expected of him, culturally and religiously, very religious culture. There's something that is expected of him. Right? We discover, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, and I'll bring it up again here, that in the book of Moses, the law of Moses, and specifically in the book of Leviticus, it talks about how they're called to care for the poor. If you own land and you are harvesting your land, you need to leave some of the land available for the poor and the immigrant to benefit from that. And this is the passage where it says this, Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 through 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Now, it seems like, and there's some debate exactly how this is to be interpreted, but it seems like probably what is meant in this passage is that essentially what would happen is the harvesters would come through and they would cut the stalks of grain. And in this case, in this story, it's the barley stalks. And so they would come through and they would cut the stalks of barley, and then they would leave them in piles known as sheaves. And then the gleaners would come through after the harvesters, and they would tie up the bundles of sheaves, and then they would also collect whatever random stalks had sort of fallen between the sheaves. That was sort of the idea. It seems like probably what it's getting at here in Leviticus is that the gleaners can pick up the random stalks that have fallen between the sheaves, but the ones that are on the edge, that are between a sheave and the edge of the field, they need to leave those for the poor so that the poor and the sojourner can come along the edge of the field and can pick up those random stalks that have fallen there. Okay, what we discover is that Boaz does way more than that for Ruth. Right? That's what's expected of him. But he goes way beyond that. We see this in verse 15 of the passage we're looking at. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some of the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." Notice this. He goes way beyond what is expected. Right? First of all, he says, not only can she glean from that which is on the side, on the edges, but actually even the stalks that are between the sheaves, she can go and glean those. But then he's even like, you know what, that's not even enough. He's like, you know what, why don't you even just pull some of the stalks of grain out of the piles there and give them to her as well. So we see Boaz going way beyond what is expected. Right? This is what kindness is. Kindness is not, you see, kindness isn't just like, okay, well, what's the bare minimum that I need to do here to be considered a good person? I want to be a good person. What do I need to do here? Right? All right, let's just make this really practical, okay? Guys, listen up. If you're married, here's just the reality. Three times a year, you are absolutely expected to celebrate your wife, okay? On her birthday, right? On your anniversary, and on Valentine's Day, you got to celebrate. I mean, that's a cultural expectation. If she's a mother, there's a fourth day, right? Okay. Those are cultural expectations. But listen, if you want to be kind, right? How about celebrating her other days as well? Not just 4 times a year. Right? Find those ways to celebrate that go beyond just these mere cultural expectations. Ladies, here's a cultural expectation, at least in my house, I'll admit. This is a cultural expectation. My wife, she's married to me. She is required to watch 1 football game a year, the Super Bowl. That's an expectation, okay? You got to at least watch the Super Bowl, right, guys? Can I get an amen to that? Ladies, you got to watch the Super Bowl. Okay. But look, hey, you want to be kind? Maybe the NFC playoff game, AFC, right? That would be great. Maybe watch a playoff game, right? Go beyond the expectation. But see, this is what kindness is. Kindness goes beyond what is expected. Another way of saying this is that the kind person is not operating with a quid pro quo mentality. Well, I do this for you, you do this for me. The kind person is not thinking in those terms. They're not thinking in a transactional manner. They are showing genuine love by going beyond what is expected. Okay, so the truly kind person extends kindness to all people. Truly kind person goes beyond what is expected. And then thirdly, this is closely related, the truly kind person goes beyond what is needed. We see Boaz ends up giving Ruth way more than she actually needs. Here, verse 17. So she gleaned in the field until morning. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Right? So what she ends up taking home, an ephah of barley, would probably have been about 29 pounds of barley, and this would probably have been in that day and age about a half a month's wages for one day. Right? So here we see Boaz going way beyond what is needed. Here, you might put it this way. Kindness, in this sense, is very much the opposite of greed. Because greed is keeping more than you need. Kindness is giving away more than they need. Right? Just a few weeks ago, these dear friends of ours who live in Florida, they came through town, and they just decided to bless us. And they took Laura and I out to a restaurant which we would just never go to. We never afford to go to it. And they took us out, and they just blessed us. And they're like, order whatever you want. Whatever you way beyond anything that we needed. And this is what kindness does. You know, be kind. Just look to just bless the socks off people. That's what kind people do. They're like, how can I bless that person? How can I give to that person? Whether it's financially or with your time or whatever resources you have available, the kind person is looking not to just give what is expected and not even just what is needed, but to go beyond what is needed. Okay, so we've seen this is what a kind person is. They extend kindness to all people. They extend kindness that goes beyond what is expected and beyond what is needed, right? So this is the point in the message where I could exhort us, I could charge us, say, let's do it, folks. Come on, let's go out there and let's be kind. Yeah, come on, amen. Let's go do it. Let's be kind. And that'd be a good message. Be something to cling to, hang on to. But if that's where I left it, we would have completely missed what this passage is all about. I don't know how long I've been talking for, but I'm going to be honest with you. We haven't even gotten to the main point yet. It won't go long. This has all just been preamble. We've all just been building up because guess what? This passage ultimately isn't about our kindness. This passage isn't about the kindness of Boaz to his employees. This passage isn't about the kindness of Boaz to Ruth. The purpose of this passage is not primarily, though certainly secondarily it may be, but primarily the purpose of this passage is not to exhort us to go out and be kind. You know what this passage is really about? This passage is about the kindness of God. And we see this if we look once again at that grammatically ambiguous verse. Beautifully ambiguous. Verse 20, and Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Yes, that relative pronoun can refer to Boaz, but I would say it also and primarily refers to God. Naomi is acknowledging the kindness of God and the kindness that is extended to her and to Ruth through Boaz. That is the kindness of God. Boaz is simply an instrument for the kindness of God. See what this passage is really communicating to Ruth and Naomi? It's communicating that he has not forgotten about them. Because if you go back to the beginning of this story, you realize, you know what? Naomi had good reason to think that God had forgotten about her. Go back to the beginning of the story, we read how she was forced to go to Moab because of a famine. And then her husband dies. And then her two sons die. And what happens with Naomi? How does she respond? She changes her name. Remember this? Her name was Naomi, is Naomi. But she ends up wanting to change her name to Mara. And what does Mara mean? Bitter. It literally means bitter. The Hebrew word for bitter is marar. And she's like, call me Mara. Not sure if you're picking up on the similarity there. She had become a bitter woman because she had started to question the kindness of God. How many of us can relate to Naomi? How many of us can relate to Mara? Perhaps you're here today and the reality is you are going through a difficult time. You can relate to the plight that Naomi and Ruth experienced. And the reality is, as you've been dealing with whatever it is that you're dealing with, you've become bitter. You've started to become angry, and you started to wonder, and even in those darkest moments, you've started to question the kindness of God. Friends, my prayer for you is that this passage will simply shout out to you, God has not forgotten about you. God is a kind God. God is pursuing you with his kindness. My hope is that you might even begin to see little signs of the kindness of God already emerging in your life. You know, here's the reality. Here's just the truth. We are really good at missing the kindness of God that is all around us. The truth is, we live in a kindness-bathed world, but we very often miss the kindness of God. And we tend to only focus on that which does not seem to reflect the kindness of God. For example, we base our understanding of the world on the news. Now, I don't know if you guys know this about the news, but the news is always bad news. You ever figure that out? I mean, it's just basically bad news. Now, do you know why it's bad news? I'm going to tell you why. Here's why the news is bad news. Okay? The reason why the news is bad news is because what is interesting to people is that which is exceptional. What is interesting to people is that which is rare. And so the news tends to put on things that are actually rare. And guess what, guys? Believe it or not, bad news is actually rare compared to the kindness of God. Let me give you an example of this. Many of you may have heard about the Air India crash that took place about 3 weeks ago. All over the news, hundreds of people died. You know what you didn't hear about? The 100,000 other flights that happened on that day that went from where they were leaving to their destination. 100,000 flights a day where there's no hitch. But that's not interesting. That's not on the news. Can you imagine on the news? Oh my gosh. Did you hear about Flight 722 from Atlanta to Denver? No, what happened? Nothing. That's not on the news. Friends, the reality is, and I don't mean to diminish the true hardships that we all face. They are real, and there is absolutely a place for us to complain before God. In fact, I think there's a whole season. The season of Advent is a season when I actually encourage you to complain, okay? So there is a place for complaining about what is going on in our lives, but we need to realize that in the big picture, God's kindness is all around us. If you woke up this morning, that is the kindness of God. If there is breath in your lungs, that is the kindness of God. If you found this place with people who are here to seek the Lord and worship him, that is the kindness of God. Friends, my prayer is that this passage would just open us up to the kindness that is all around us. And of course, as we look at the kindness that emerges in this story, the kindness of Boaz for Ruth and Naomi, we've seen this already. That what's interesting about the book of Ruth is that it is a story within a story. We see this, we talked about this a few weeks ago, where the beginning of the book and the end of the book make it very clear that this story is to be read as a story within a story. And so the story of Boaz's redemption of Ruth and Naomi actually points to, it is a story within the larger story of David's redemption of Israel. And then we discover that the story of David's redemption of Israel is actually itself just a story within a story. It is a story that points to the redemption of all of creation through Jesus. Ultimately, when we look here at the kindness of Boaz, my hope is not that you're just thinking, boy, I hope I find a guy like Boaz. My hope is that you're not thinking, I need to be more like Boaz. My hope is you'll say, you know what? That reminds me of Jesus. That reminds me of the kindness that God has revealed to us in Jesus. Friends, the heart of the gospel is that we have a kind God. In Jesus, we have a God who loves all people. Jesus came, he said, anyone who comes to me is welcome at the table. Jesus welcomed all people at the table, said, come to me and receive my love. He extended the kindness of God to all people. In Jesus, we see that God extends a kindness that goes beyond what we could possibly have expected. On the cross, Jesus died for us. How could we ever have expected that? And in Jesus, we find a kindness that goes beyond anything we could ever need. Boaz, in his kindness, gives Ruth half a month's wages, beyond what she needed. In Jesus, we have eternal life. Friends, the heart of the gospel is that we have a kind God. And as we rest in that kindness, then that can propel us to be kind to others. We don't read this and see it as an exhortation to be kind. We read this and see it as a reflection of the kindness that God has for us as revealed in Jesus. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Communion is an opportunity to rest in the kindness of God. In communion, we are reminded that the love of God is not just some sort of sappy, emotional, subjective word. A lot of people in our world will say God is love. I believe that God is love. But in Jesus, that love becomes kindness. In Jesus, God puts on work clothes. In Jesus, the love of God becomes a concrete historical reality in which he comes and he enters into this world and on the cross gives his life for us. So as we take the elements, the bread and the cup, they remind us of the love of God as revealed in Jesus.